Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Family Business Podcast. Absolutely delighted to be joined by Dennis Jaffe today, and we are going to be talking about what family businesses can be doing to help reinvent the family enterprise as we emerge from this global crisis. Firstly, Dennis, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here again.
And we were just speaking a little bit off air about how this has all impacted us. Before we get into the detail of the show, just want to make sure you're all safe and well and looking after yourself in the US.
Yeah, very well. I'm a, grandparent and parent, so all my kids are out. So it's my wife and I, and we're, kind of have a, nice house and garden, and we can walk around the community. So
Fantastic.
we're just waiting for things to open up.
Great.
And seeing how just even the city space around us is going to be different.
Yeah, there's obviously going to be an awful lot of changes as things do start to open up, and we might get into some of those as we progress through the show. For those audience members who may not be aware of you and your work, could you just give them an overview of your background, your history, and the work that you're doing now?
Yes, well, I've been working. I'm kind of a blend of I have a background in management consulting, and I'm also a family therapist. So those two things were kind of business consulting and family therapy were two different areas, and I was tending toward the management consulting, and then the work in the field of family business came out, and it was all of a sudden I discovered that I could combine those two interests, which I thought were very separate, and do both. So since the 80s, actually, I've been working with families who have a business together, and I don't work as a therapist, but I help families go across generations. And in the past few years, I've been traveling all over the world and looking at the commonalities that large successful business families have in how they work as a growing innovative family.
And again, we'll come on to talk about it a little bit later on, but you have recently published a book which is entitled Borrowed from Your Grandchildren. Those that are watching on YouTube will see it over my shoulder there.
Yep, there it is. Yep.
And it's a fascinating study that, as you say, is looking at the sort of features and characteristics that are common amongst successful family enterprises over a long period of time. So hopefully we can get into some of the detail on that a little bit later on as well. But we are, I guess we need to be mindful of the fact that there are different stages to the coronavirus crisis, and different parts of the world are at different phases of that. So it would be naive to say that we are all coming out of this crisis now, because I know there are countries that are not in that position. But as we do emerge from the crisis, and there's this phrase that's being thrown around at the moment, which is the new normal, which I think if you look back over previous crises, that maybe the new normal is the fact that we move from one crisis to another. But as we do emerge, what are the sorts of things that family enterprises and family businesses can be doing now?
When we talk about and have things like the new normal, it's I think a little bit of a wish fulfillment that we've been through all this stuff, and then we'll come back and the world will be something that's more or less predictable and orderly. And there's another possibility, one that we really have to entertain, which is that the ripples of instability. It isn't we've had a little chaos and now we're back on our plateau. It may be that we're on a continuing change, and it may be that the instability that we're experiencing now is just something that's going to be going on for a decade or more, even then. So the new normal is an example of some of the ways that we approach things by kind of saying, well, I'm anxious now, but things will be okay later. And there's that makes us feel good, but it may not be the best way to plan and look ahead to at the turbulence that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a danger that because we are all kind of sheltering and have been in lockdown, that there's the assumption that when the doors are flung open, that everything will return back to how it was, albeit with perhaps new
Right,
measures that are
and
in
we're
place.
sitting there, and we've been, like sitting in our homes with our families, and it's been stressful for some when, educating your kids and being together with your spouse, which a lot of us haven't experienced in a long time, and not working. And so we make ourselves feel comfortable by saying, well, gee, it feels good. We're having a good time. We're eating together. We're playing. We're, doing things together. Let's just not think about the future, because there's nothing we can do. And then we'll come out of it, and we'll figure out what to do then. And there's something to that, again, like the new normal, but it's also, it means that when we're postponing the anxiety of planning and figuring out what to do.
Mm. And I guess, I mean, if we look at perhaps the last recession, but back in the 2007, 2008 and 9, with the financial crisis, there were elements to that of predictability in that we saw that there was a drying up of credit and that there would need to be other means in order to operate within that environment. What we're seeing now is almost unpredictable as to what's going to happen. So what should businesses be looking at now, given that there is this element to this crisis that is particularly unpredictable?
So I mean, it's interesting to get back. The book that I wrote, which came out just a month before the crisis, is about 100-year families and how they've been successful. And the concept that I wrote about was resilience, and how families have to continually reinvent themselves, and the ones that are successful are the ones that can listen to new ideas and adapt and use their resources to change even something that's been successful. And so this is the good news is the pandemic struck, and I was just starting my book tour, and it was like, oh God, everything's changed. Is my book relevant? And what I've been finding from families is that I'm writing about reinventing and principles of families working together to kind of find new ways, and it's indeed relevant. So the families have to begin to kind of understand that whatever the temptation is to do something kind of fast and decisive and make a plan. It's like some of the planning. The planning models that we have is you kind of gather information, you make a plan, you implement the plan, you evaluate the plan. That's a rational model. Well, what if the information keeps changing and you have to implement something, but then it's changing? So we're in a model where you can't, it's more of a spiral, and you can't invent yourself. So one family is a wonderful family nearby that has run a huge restaurant, that very, very fancy restaurant that everybody wants to come to, and outdoor seating, indoor seating, hundreds of people, and boom, it hit them. And they were saying, well, gee, lots of tables together in a big thing, that's not going to work, and we're closed, and so they started to think of new ideas, and they set up, and they asked their employees who they wanted to keep on. Well, if we have to think of new ideas. So they did, of course, takeout food, but then they started, they started to kind of make family meals, and they started to kind of figure out new ways. And they really invited everybody on their staff. They said, hey, anybody that thinks of a new idea for a business, it's like, just start it. Mm-hmm. And they started a little retail store selling, I don't know what it was, but it was successful, and maybe it was masks and stuff. And they just did a lot of different things, and they're reinventing themselves. And when it reopens, manufacturing businesses, offices, they're not going to look the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of reopening is a hard one. Now here's where it gets into the family. Family, for example, has been used to a certain level of income, or the family has been used to a certain predictability. And one is that some of the family members don't even know about the business; they just depended on it. Other people are not really clear of how much strain there's been on the business and how difficult it's going to be. So families, it isn't just about what are you doing with the business. They have to plan and talk together about what they're going to do differently. And sometimes the idea of sacrifice is one that they have to become used to, and the family members have to discuss it. They also have to kind of do a little bit of a review of what was working and what do we have to do differently now. So they may say, well, we have a this kind of a model, or this kind of a kind of a family management team, and they may have to rethink it.
Yeah.
So they're selling the business, closing the business. Some families have been planning to expand, and now they have to contract. And so there's a lot of internal discussion.
Yeah.
And some of it is about we have to sacrifice together, and other parts of the discussion are about we have to think of some new ideas, and we can't continue the business as it was.
And I guess there's different roles for different generations in those discussions as well, because if there are new ideas that the next generation have, so you mentioned the restaurant local to you, where they've said to everybody, look, come up with new ideas, come up with ways that we can diversify our risk a little bit in terms of what we're exposed to. There's presumably a role for the next gen to be saying, actually, is now the time to, and again, a phrase that I think has been thrown around an awful lot during the crisis is this pivot phrase of, do we need to move more towards this as a family or as a business, and prompting those discussions.
Well, that was one of the findings in my research about resilient families. Is I studied 100 families all over the world that were successful, moving past the third generation. And one of the questions I asked is, when you had an innovation and a major change, where did it come from? How did it get started? And the model in people's minds is that it comes from the leaders, and they think of new ideas and they start it. But in reality, what they said, about 60% of the major changes that they reported, they said they came from the younger generation. They went to business school, and their professor had an idea. They had friends. They had other ideas. They worked as an intern in a venture capital firm, and they learned about this. And the ideas came from the younger generation. Now, what these families did, and this is important, is younger generations always have ideas, and some of them are stupid, and some of them need a little work, and some of them are just great, and just run with them. And but the older generation has to be open. First of all, they have to be listening. And if they're saying, "Hey, I'm so busy, and we're in such a crisis right now, and I have to get back, get work. We have to get this open. I don't have time to listen to you."
Yeah,
that's example of being closed to innovation. Open innovation. Say, "Hey, I need your help, and we need to, be opening up, and please help me." But we can also find some time to talk about new ideas and consider them. And it's a kind of a both and. So the older generation has to be open, and the younger generation has to pitch in, but also be invited to share their ideas.
Yeah, and I guess traditionally there would be communication forums in place to help families to communicate, that would typically be, not always, but typically be in person. Now that we're not able to meet, are you seeing people using technology to continue
Well,
those, or
yeah.
are they
Well,
on
I
the
mean,
whole?
everybody. I mean, including older people. Like I'm a grandparent, and I can tell you personally, I've never been on Facebook. I don't know what Twitter is.
Hmm.
I don't know what Snapchat is. It's like I am not a social media person. Now I've been living in the past 8 weeks on Zoom. I certainly know what Zoom is, and I'm learning from my kids. When I have a problem, I call up one of my kids, and they laugh and chuckle, and then they show me. So there's a learning process, but and families have all families have gotten comfortable, with virtual meetings and things like that. But they have to, there's some other learning that they have to do about doing business at a distance.
Yeah.
And you say they families communicate. Well, one of the big problems in families is that the people that are in charge, particularly when they're in a crisis, they surge ahead and they just do things and they don't communicate. They
Hmm.
stop communicating in a time when it's actually more important to communicate.
Yeah. And I guess the current situation provides an excuse, if that's the right word, so almost in inverted commas, the excuse for people to say, well, we couldn't have the normal meetings that we would normally have, so I had to make that decision for the
Right.
benefit of the business. And it kind of creates its own issues.
So one of the things that families have to do is watch their impulsive desire to kind of take action and do things, or their desire to kind of say, well, let's wait and see what happens. That's not a good strategy. Jumping ahead and just doing something is not the best strategy. It's somewhere in between. You have to take action, but you have to be thoughtful and make sure that your troops, your family are with you, that you've checked with people, that you've looked at a kind of wider circle in your community, and really have a solid strategy rather than just jump forward on your own.
Hmm. And you mentioned now sort of a good time for families to undertake a review. Would you start at a point of why are we in business together? Is it that big of a review? Is now the time to be having those discussions?
Oh,
Bearing in mind that,
absolutely, because it's not a failure for a family business to go out of business, and it's also has to happen sometimes. I mean, I live in a kind of a part of San Francisco, and we expect a third of our restaurants and community local stores to go out of business. So all of those families are feeling pain, and they're certainly experiencing loss, but they also have to reinvent themselves. And so the families have to be really questioning what they're doing, because they can't continue. The rents have been going up, and now everybody wants to renegotiate their rent, but the landlords, they have their own family businesses, and
mm,
they're not all giant businesses, so there's a lot of rethinking. Now people are thinking, should I sell buildings? Should I take the cash out now? Should I can I continue the business? Should I continue the business in a new way? Do we have to create something different? Do we have to make different products?
mhm.
We need partners. Uh, there are all kinds of questions that the family has to ask, and just forging forward and being decisive is only a good idea if you're going in the right, in a good direction.
Yeah,
And it's only the right thing if you're willing to kind of say, whoops, that's not working. Slow down,
yeah.
stop, look, not right.
Yeah, and I guess in those communications and in the conversations that people be having with their families, recognizing that um, the current health crisis that we're facing as a world, this is a global issue. This isn't a
Right.
regional or particular market issue. It's something that is affecting the human
Right.
race on a health level. And the resulting lockdowns and restrictions that we have has meant that a way of life that we are used to, we have now lost, albeit hopefully temporarily, although we may emerge into something that's new. We as individuals are most likely undergoing a grief process as a result of that, and the anxiousness and concern and worry that we are all feeling as a result of that will be impacting how we make decisions and how we communicate with each other. And because we're going to be at different stages of that, how can families kind of put a check on the fact that there could be somebody who's making a decision because they're feeling particularly bullish on a good sunny day, whereas the following day the reality of the situation starts to dawn on them again? And
well, this is so families have to get together, and I think the other thing is that sometimes when you're feeling pain, and another issue that comes up along with the pain and the loss is a feeling of unfairness. I didn't do this. Why should I have to? Why should my business be closed? Why should I have to do this? Why is so and so charging me so much? Why can't I get the supplies that I want? There's a feeling of unfairness, and the reaction that we have to unfairness is we pull in and we say, well, then I'm going to take care of myself, because that it's not fair. Whereas a more, the other response is to understand that everybody feels that it's unfair, and maybe you need to ask help and seek and reach out to others to say, what are we going to do to keep this is negotiating with landlords, negotiating businesses coming together. I'm talking to a couple of families that are saying, well, let's work together on some of these things. There's a number of ways that reaching out when you're in pain rather than hunkering down is a better strategy.
And again, but because of the nature of this crisis, because we're all going through it, there's not going to be a business on the planet that won't have been impacted by this. Some positively because they've been able to PPE, for example. But it's not as if it's impacting one business and they're going to somebody who's not impacting, going, look, this is happening. We can all relate on this. We can all start to share our own stories and ideas as a result of the fact we are all impacted by this.
Right. It's a challenge, and again, I feel like it's unfair. But if I'm a small businessman or a manufacturer, I have employees. They feel like it's unfair. We have suppliers, we have landlords, we have costs of doing business, and now distancing regulations. There's a lot of adjustment, and I think the people that are pulling together collectively are in a stronger place than people that say, well, that's not fair, so I'm going to stop paying my rent, which is, for some people that's the only thing that they can do. But at least they need to be in touch, with their landlords, who may also be a small family business that depends on the income.
And I guess to a certain extent, family businesses are positioned well in terms of assisting with the communication during this time, because they are a family, they are connected, there are those bonds between them. Whereas a corporate non-family owned business, to try and get those sort of key stakeholders around the table at any given time, you're impacting lots of different people in a different way. Would that be fair?
The family can look long term and kind of tighten their belts together, I think more so than a bunch of strangers who are investing in a business, who just say, well, investments, that didn't work out, I'm going to look at something else.
Yeah. And if the primary driver is just pure profit, and somebody who's an investor is thinking, actually, I'm not going to get my return now, I can get out, that you're not necessarily going to have those same views in a family-owned business, because there normally is that longer-term aim and strategy for the family. Great. And given that you've studied 100-year-old family business, or those that have survived that long, what lessons have they taken from previous crises that could be applied to now? Because they would have seen World War II, they would have
Right. Well,
seen.
exactly. The families, the 100-year families that I studied, all had crises. They all went through wars. They had government takeovers. They were kicked out of countries and emigrated to new countries. They had, kind of, conflicts. They business losses, new technologies. They all had to deal with them. And the question that I asked is not, not so much what were the crises, but how did you respond? And working together and reaching out to others and listening to ideas and looking and thinking for the long term and negotiating with the people around them. Those were the kinds of responses, and being willing to invest in new businesses and go. I mean, some families saw that the businesses that they were in were, were reaching a point where they just weren't producing the return, and they weren't as good a business as they were, for the last, 30 years. And they had to, you use the word pivot. They had to pivot and set up new businesses. And so they were able to invest in new businesses and go in new directions. And over, a dozen years or so, they went from one major, business to others.
Mhm.
So resiliency is what I see, and the ability to kind of move on and reinvent themselves. Half of
Yeah.
the families in my study sold their legacy business and went into other investments or bought other businesses. They've diversified. They've done all kinds of changes.
Hmm. And you referred in the book to generative family enterprise. Could you give us
Yeah,
a
well,
feel for what you mean by that?
the idea of generativity is continual wealth creation, and one of the mindsets and the ideas that we have, which is wrong, is that family businesses, one wealth creator creates a great deal of wealth, a big pot of money, and then the rest of the generation just spend it, and then it's all gone.
Hmm.
Well, the generative family and the families that I studied, they didn't create one pot of money. They created a lot of value at the beginning, because that's how they became a family business. But the next generations and later generations also created value, and also created not just financial value, but non-financial value, education, values, working together, social impact, community activities. So what's characteristic of these families is they're continually creating value over the generations. They're not doing it just one time. And the funny thing is that by creating value in all kinds of ways, that's one of the reasons I think that they're successful in their business and finance. They continue to create wealth, but they use the wealth and think about what they want to use the wealth for
Hmm.
non-financially. What is our wealth for?
Yeah.
What do we want to achieve in the world? And what do we want to achieve in our family? Those are the questions that they ask.
And that, I think, is a really important distinction over and above pure shareholder return. For somebody who is in business for pure profit and is looking for that to provide a return on their investment for however long they're looking to hold that shareholding
Well,
or
a
run
family
that
business,
company.
you see, the owners are not just together for profits. They have a personal relationship. They're parents and children and cousins, and they care about each other, and they watch each other's lives. So by definition, the family owners have a broader agenda than just making a profit. They're not against the profit, but
Hmm.
they want more than that. And because they're looking to pass it to their children, they're looking long term. And
Mm.
these are the two defects that people say see in public corporations, that they're thinking short term, and that they're not really looking at broader than just making money. So family businesses are a great now example of another way that business can be done, which is more values based and long term oriented.
Yeah. And given that the businesses that you would have spoken to at some stage in their history would have been a first generation startup business,
Mhm.
at what stage did they start to look at the longer term view? Because if an entrepreneur is thinking, I have a great business idea and this is how I want to do it, and I want it, I don't think there's many that will go, and I want it to be there for 5 generations time. But at some stage along that journey, they do have that discussion with, perhaps it's when the second generation's looking to move into the business. Was there a
Right.
commonality there with what you found?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that, again, that was interesting is that the first generation wealth creator, that's not a family business. That's my business. I make the decisions. I do it the way I want it. So it's like me. I may want to have a family business, but you don't have a family business. You intend one. And what happens is the second and third generation is faced with the task of, we want to create a family business. We have to collaborate. We have to communicate. And these are all things that the older generation didn't do very well. So the second, third generation has to create a collaborative culture and define their values and define how they want to work together. And this is the task after they've built a great business. The family has to create what I call a great family. And that means working together, collaborating, becoming a team, having shared goals, developing their resources and capability, and their social commitment. Those are all the things that a family has to do after they've created their successful business.
Sure. And I'm guessing that that's where the governance is then introduced
Right.
to these types of businesses, is to allow them to kind of formalize that side of things.
Right. The older generation, they don't see the need for governance. Like, I run things. What do I need governance for?
Yeah.
And and the younger generation says, well, I have a bunch of cousins and siblings, and there's a lot of people, and we got to communicate and get their ideas and find roles and work together in different ways and do all the different things that the family needs to have done. And it's a pretty complicated, and so we got to organize it. So that's how that kind of grows up.
Yeah. And the statistics or findings from your study also demonstrate that the existence of governance has a positive impact on the longevity of the business. Is that a direct correlation, would you say?
Well, I didn't compare them with anything. So I looked at 100-year businesses, and they all seem to have governance. So I would say that probably governance is important to 100-year families, because I never saw a 100-year family that didn't have it. But who knows? I mean, it just governance is a good thing in itself. It means organizing, and it means defining roles. And of course, when you have 100 family members, and they're doing a whole lot of different things as a family, you've got to be organized, and you've got to do these things. So it doesn't cause business success, but it's certainly necessary.
Yeah, and hindsight, I know, is a wonderful thing. But if there are families who are listening to this now who perhaps don't have governance structures and those communication forums in place as a family, again, would you sort of recommend that now's as good a time as any to, there's an old, I
Well, they
think, a
should
Chinese proverb.
start that the first and second generation doesn't need complicated governance, because there aren't that many people. And so one of the things that I show in the book is that governance evolves as things get more complicated. Governance gets more better developed to cope with the complexity. So business starts off with simple governance, a simple board or council, and then as there are more people, you have more you have to add more things.
Yeah. And I think that's the key message, is that it is an evolution, isn't it? It's not something where you put a
Right. It's
governance
not,
structure in place
I have
now and
governance
that's
or I
it.
don't have governance.
Yeah.
Governance is a moving target. It's a whole lot of different things.
Yeah, and I think the word governance can seem quite intimidating. As you say, to the senior generation, it's perhaps seen as a brake on their behaviour and a controlling mechanism to kind of stop them from doing what
Well,
they want to
they
do.
have to, it's about listening and it's about give and take. So it isn't about you're in charge and you're not. Even if the older generation is in charge, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't listen to the next generation, um, and take it seriously. So the fact that they're in charge doesn't mean they have a license to not listen to anybody.
Uh-huh. Yeah, completely agree. And there will be these governance structures that are sort of bandied around as the solution. Governance is the solution in terms of any potential issue within a family business. But I think it's also right to point out to be cautious about going into it for the sake of having governance. There needs to be a
Well,
purpose
governance
behind it.
think of governance as a solution to a problem. So you define what the problem is. The problem is nobody knows who's in charge, or the person in charge, people don't trust that person, or there's so many people and they have different ideas and they don't know what's going on. That's the problem, and governance is a solution to it. So to say, do you have governance, to me, is not really a good question. The question is, what is governance doing for you? Why do you have it? And when you say, here's the problem, and here is what we're doing to solve it, e.g., we're having a council, or we're having a board, or we're having a kind of an education program. That's the governance is the solution. But you got to define what the problem is, not should we have governance.
Completely agree. And again, from the study, presumably the families are willing, happy, and comfortable in putting in the required effort that is needed in order to come up with the correct
They
governance
want
structures.
it. So they want governance, and then they call a consultant and they say, Mr. Consultant, or Madam Consultant, give me governance, make a culture. And then the consultant says back, well, we have to get together as a family and we have to talk about things, and say, wait a minute, I want to hire you. Why do we have to get together? And so they begin to see that you can't outsource, some of these things. You have to do them together, and you can have an expert help you put it together, but you can't have an expert do the job for you.
Because otherwise it doesn't have meaning and it just sits on the shelf gathering
The family
dust.
is not doing it.
Yeah.
It's and the family will fall apart,
Yeah.
not really hang together.
It's a bit like someone drawing up a personal training plan and you saying to someone else, can you go and do the exercise for me?
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's a great example. It's like, oh yeah, I would like you to exercise for me because I don't have time.
Yeah. You're not going to get any of the results.
Yeah, it's like, okay.
So what other lessons we've taken resilience and being generative and the impact of governance on these successful long-term family businesses. And one of the points that you make in the book is around learning from successful businesses is a good thing. But there's no point looking back at those necessarily that aren't successful, because you learn more from the ones that are than the mistakes that have been made.
That's what you learn. You learn from, the wonderful businesses. That's why we love to hear about great stories. And so the idea that by definition, a business that's lasted for 3 generations and 100 years is got to be doing something right. And so let's see what we can learn from them, rather than looking at businesses that have destroyed themselves and gotten into family feuds and lawsuits and lost money. You can't learn a lot. You can say, don't do this, don't do that, but it doesn't really, you can do, not do all kinds of things and still not be doing the right thing.
Yeah. And again,
Um,
hindsight's a wonderful thing, because you
yeah,
look back and go, well, you shouldn't have done that, or you should have done this
right.
at that stage. Whereas
Yeah,
these are businesses that have that longevity in them.
right. Yeah.
And do you get obviously you're working with these families over a period of time as well. Do you get the feeling that they are still continually looking forward in terms of that continual
Well,
generative
it's never
attitude?
done. You see, it isn't, governance isn't something you have, it's something you do. And as the family develops and new people grow up and new people enter the family, and new people, gain control and influence, the governance has to be, um, you know, edited a little bit.
Hmm. And presumably the longer term view, and the fact that the title of your book is borrowed from your grandchildren,
Right.
kind of gives an insight into that mindset of this. We're custodians here. We're not, this isn't ours to necessarily do with as we please. It's, we have a responsibility to future generations.
Right. You have to pass it on so you can enjoy it. You have a beautiful, car, or piece of art, or something like that, or a house. You enjoy it, but you keep it in good repair, and you have to invest in it, and then you give it to your grandchildren or your children in better shape than you got it.
Hmm.
That's what being a steward is. And so there's a benefit, and you certainly have fun, and enjoy it, but you also have to, look after it.
Hmm. And that doesn't have to mean that those future generations come in and work in the business and are shackled to it in the way that, their destiny is set out for them. It's that
No,
the
and
entity
by the third
exists.
generation in these families, they mostly have non-family CEOs and
Hmm.
executives, and the people in the family are working on governance. They're working on social impact. They're working on board as board members. They're doing looking for new ideas. They're reaching out. They're not doing building the business that exists.
Yeah. And I guess that ties back into the current situation that we find ourselves in today, is there might be rising next gen family members who are feeling a polarization of their emotional attachment to the business, in that they might be thinking this is under threat now, and therefore I want to do something to help keep it going and help it to survive. Or
Or
alternatively, this is not for me. I'm
yeah, exactly, and that's the choice they have. Every next generation person has to decide, um, uh, whether they want this business, or whether they want to say, well, the business has been good. It's been great for my grandfather and my great grandfather and my father, but right now I think it should be over, and I want to, go, be a doctor, or
Mhm.
do something else, and it's not my thing.
Yeah. And one of my personal bugbears is the statistics around what success for a family business means, and that there is this almost expectation on every family business to pass it to the next generation, because that's what success looks like. Whereas what you've seen in your study is that it doesn't have to be the same entity being passed down through
Right.
generations. It can have iterations and
Right.
diversifications away from what the core business was.
Yeah, I mean, if you produce a next generation, a child that has gone to great schools and developed great skills and has something that's really of value, then they can create value far beyond the business, because they've been prepared to contribute to the world. And so a productive, working, the successful person is a wealth creator for the family, just as a business is.
Mhm.
And a lot of families say, well, that's what we want, is productive children, not necessarily a business that gives everybody great income.
Mhm. Great. And just mindful of our time,
Yeah.
but before we go, in terms of any sort of final tips or suggestions that families might be wanting to look at, given where we are currently? What would your thoughts be on that?
Well, I think that the current challenge is to get together with the people that are kind of your tribe, in the employees, people in the community, family members, and kind of look ahead and say, what do we want to do together? A more outward facing thing, and then beginning to just think about and try things out, and understand that the world is going to be, this isn't the end of change. When we go back to work, it's in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for
Well, this was
your time.
great set of discussions, and
Yeah,
we covered a lot of topics. And I just want to say that book is Borrowed from Your Grandchildren. It's on Amazon, and if people want to hear a lot of stories about successful families, that's where they can go.
fantastic. And we will provide a link, sorry, in the show notes. We'll
Great.
put that in there so people can go and follow that. And where else can people find out about you and your work, Dennis?
I have a website, DennisJaffe.com, and I put up things like this, interviews, podcasts, articles. I just really want to share them with people that are interested in it.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, we will put links in the show notes on there. We already know that you're not a fan of social media, but we will be promoting this on there as well. So we'll be pointing people towards you.
And I have a website, and small set of things.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't know anything about Snapchat, or there's something called TikTok
you won't
as
find
well
me on
now.
Twitter, but you certainly you can find me on the web.
Fantastic. And as I say, we'll signpost as many people as we can to your site as well. There's some great stuff on there for people to read as well. But once again, thank you very much for your time and
Thank you very much,
your
Russ. It
input.
was great. Yeah.
And we'll see you
Take care.
soon. Cheers.